So David Gordon Green has finally spoken and clarified what he wanted to do with Halloween Ends. I'm not as confused as other people. I think it's very clear he wanted to do his version of Halloween and not really stick to what the other movies kind of laid out of our basic understanding of Michael Myers and the mythology. That is my perspective. So we're going to hear him speak and go into first what he planned not to do and then go into what he planned to do with the Halloween trilogy.
In a brand new interview with Movie Maker, director David Gordon Green says, make you scratch your head because you know there's a path to destruction and it doesn't end with a guy in a mask. It's something dark, disturbing, and fascinating. So, the interviewer asks David Gordon Green, Halloween Ends could be anything you wanted, and you were like, let's just make it sexy. Green responded to this by saying, we had to decide how we wanted to wrap up these characters. How do we want to make it not just a nice, neat bow on a franchise? Honestly, we never even considered making a Laurie and Michael movie.
Okay, so he's on the record. He didn't want to do and never intended to do a Laurie Michael kind of confrontation movie. I will just add one qualification. In terms of the early treatments or alternate versions, I do think Michael had a slightly bigger role. Now, from what I understand, the other versions, Michael is killed off early. So Michael was never going to be the central focus in these other treatments, but I do think we probably may have gone a little bit more of Laurie. But again, I want to stress I don't have access to the actual scripts. I have to go with secondhand testimony, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think it's fair to say if you were expecting a Michael movie by the third chapter, that was never going to happen. And he's confirming that. Now, was that a good idea or a bad idea? Well, I think one thing is clear, given the box office, is that promoting the fight that they did have, and you can like it or dislike it, they really misrepresented how big that is in the movie. It's really not a big part of the movie. It's really just at the very end. It seems just something they tacked on. You can say they did a good enough job, but it really doesn't build up in the way you think these things would. So it just feels something they just added on just to please at least part of the audience, and they just wanted to get it done, move on to other things, at least from my perspective. And now David will say what he did want to do, and we're going to respond to that.
Continues saying, so how did we want to go out? By doing what no one except us would do. Make a love story. Now, this is the most frustrating thing of all. Now, listen, obviously I wanted some character development in this movie. I didn't want it to just be a 2-hour showdown between Laurie and Michael. That also would have sucked. But if I were to walk into Minions 3, Gru needs glasses, and then suddenly Jason Voorhees shows up and starts killing people, I'm also going to be disappointed. Maybe if they would have advertised it as a love story, this movie would be doing better at the box office right now, too.
So, what they wanted to do was apparently a love story. And Michael is just sort of a guest star in this larger story with Corey and Allison and Laurie. I think what's interesting is looking at other responses to what he said. I think they're being a little naive. I'm not trying to be super cynical, but I think, frankly, to me, what this Blumhouse trilogy has been about is for him kind of a career stepping stone. I'm sure he likes John Carpenter and even Stephen King because there is a lot of John Carpenter and there is a lot of Stephen King in Halloween Ends. Whether you think that's a good thing or bad thing, those are kind of the dominant influences. But I don't think looking at his whole track record, he's ever been obsessed with horror, so he's not a hardcore horror fan. And it seems he just strikes me as a John Carpenter and Stephen King fan who, when given the chance, was like, oh, you're going to have Michael Myers, you're going to do this and that. Say, okay, we're going to do our version of Michael Myers. And that's what they did. And I think people, frankly, were just fooled by 2018 and thought, oh, okay, this is the classical Michael. That's what they want to do. And that's what they're going to give us. And the answer is no. They were just doing a certain version of Michael that worked with that film. But I wasn't misled. I kind of knew from the beginning that this isn't really Michael. This doesn't feel like Michael to me. I'm not as angry as other people. I am frustrated because I do think you were given a responsibility and they should have done a minimal amount of Michael in a certain way. But they decided not to do that. And I think looking back at Halloween Kills, just because we had a lot of Michael didn't mean a lot to me because Michael acted in a very erratic, weird manner. But at least a lot of people were satisfied because there was a lot of killing and destruction. And that's their idea of Michael, but not to me. Now, is this a good idea unto itself? Well, I keep thinking back to Zack Snyder, where Zack also began in horror, but then he drifted to, quote, other things like superhero films or whatever you call them, historical fantasy films, and so on and so forth. But I don't ever feel that Zack Snyder exploited the horror fandom. To me, he just evolved to other genres. But there's always been a strong horror component in all his films. And he came back to horror recently. So I don't see the binary. It seems like David Gordon Green really thinks of it as you either have to be a horror director or an auteur director. And Zack Snyder proves the opposite. You can kind of do both. It just depends on how you're going to do it. For instance, when I see some of his DC films, yes, I'm seeing a Zack Snyder film, but I'm also seeing a Superman film. I'm also seeing a Batman film. I'm not picking between the two. I'm getting both. And it seems the problem with this whole trilogy, it's really been about him. Probably the only exception here is Laurie and Jamie Lee Curtis. And I'm sure they crafted the trilogy the way they wanted to. They got what they wanted. It's finished. It now has a very specific identity onto itself. But again, from a horror fan perspective as well as a Halloween perspective, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't seem to align with what we saw in the other films. I understand it worked for them, but it's not working for the vast majority of the Halloween fandom. And now we know this beyond a shadow of a doubt because the numbers are overwhelming that if you do like Halloween Ends, that's fine. That's a very small minority and it's already declining. And I think onto itself, the idea of a love story within the Halloween universe is fine, but they were clearly using Michael as bait and trying to trick people to get into the door or sign up for Peacock. And that's what they did. And it would have been better off if they had been very clear from the beginning. Because even when I reported on the leaks, I thought they would at least moderate Corey, but I was shocked how much Corey is in this film. And I was actually going to do a video before this, and I ended up erasing it because the basic punchline of that video was that they kind of misadvertised and misrepresented this movie. If you want to see a love story that kind of has Michael Myers as a guest star, by all means, see it and enjoy it. But that's not what the trailers really hinted at. And that's the real film. And that's not in the trailers. That's not in the TV spots. And I think that is misleading the audience beyond a certain legitimate point. And they should have been much more upfront in retrospect, but they weren't. And that's caused a lot of friction with the fandom. So if you want to see Halloween Ends, by all means, enjoy it. But it's not really a Halloween movie in the traditional sense. But I think for a lot of other Halloween fans, we were given the expectation that this was going to be at least somewhat of a Michael Myers film. Maybe not 100%, but it should have been more than this. And I think that's where a lot of the anger and frustration is coming from, that they definitely didn't intend to do a Michael Myers film. And they didn't. Well, if they didn't want to do that, they should have said so much earlier. And that would have saved us all a lot of grief and anxiety.